Good evening everyone, welcome to Bajirao IAS Academy, the Hindu News Analysis. Today is 29th November 2025 and today we have a list of important topics from different newspapers, and one by one we'll be discussing all these topics. And the first very important topic is about the impartiality of a nominated governor. Now in fact, in states, governor is known as a constitutional head. Governor is not directly elected by the people, and governor is also not directly elected by the people, indirectly elected by the people as well, right? So a governor in a state is just a ceremonial head. So therefore, in this context, it is expected that governor should perform a role as a neutral, and at the same point of time, he should be impartial. He should not show any partiality towards the central government or any other government in the state as well. Now, in this context, we'll be discussing the role of governor in a state as a constitutional head. In fact, from the syllabus point of view, this is very important for General Studies paper 2, and there is a high possibility of asking questions about the role and functions of the governor. Now let's understand about this role of governor and why it is in news. Now let's first understand that, if we talk about the role of governor as a constitutional head in the state. Now in fact, the role of governor is always a clash between constitutional design and contemporary practice. What governors have been practicing nowadays and what constitution has actually envisioned from the governor as an office. So there's always a conflict. Now we all knew that we have been discussing it as well, that in the state of Tamil Nadu, the Tamil Nadu state government has not been giving assent to the bills passed by the state legislative assemblies. Several bills are pending before the governor. So governor is not giving assent to those bills. So as a reason, Tamil Nadu state government has approached the Supreme Court. And in this context, Supreme Court has also issued directions to the governors and the president that they have to give assent to the bills within a proper time frame. So however, after this timeline set by the judiciary to the president and to the governors, a president of India, she actually sought a 16th presidential reference under Article 143 of the Indian Constitution. We all knew about this. Under Article 143 of the Indian Constitution, so President of India sought 16th presidential reference from the Supreme Court. However, so this 16th presidential reference has actually revived the debates on the letter and spirit of the Constitution, right? So apart from that, the Constituent Assembly debates. So what was the role of the governor that the Constituent Assembly was expected from the governor? Now particularly Dr. B.R. Ambedkar clarifications, all these factors actually offer us critical and important insights into the intended role of the governor. So as a constitutional head, what is the exact role of the governor? So it is expected that he should be neutral and impartial as well. However, the contemporary practice is starkly or contrastingly indicating what constitution has envisioned from the governor. So let's understand what the Supreme Court has held in the 16th financial reference, because this 16th financial reference under Article 143, the President of India has actually asked the Supreme Court that whether judiciary can actually intervene in the functioning of the executive, that whether judiciary can actually set the timelines for the governor and the president who comes under the executive. So if judiciary set those timelines, it amounts to the violation of separation of powers, which is part of the basic structure doctrine. Now in this context, the Supreme Court has clearly mentioned that judiciary should not intervene in the matters of executive when it comes to giving assent to the bills passed by the state legislative assemblies. So therefore, judiciary has categorically held that if judiciary set those timelines for the president and governor to give assent to the bills passed by the state legislative assemblies, then it amounts to the interference of the judiciary into the executive matters, and it also amounts to the violation of separation of powers. However, The Supreme Court has also opined that governors cannot sit on bills for an indefinite period of time without any proper reason. If governors are not giving assent to the bills without any proper rationale or reason, then it may attract the judicial intervention into that particular matter. So this is what the Supreme Court has held in this 16th financial reference. So let's move on to the other important dimension. What is the vision of the Constituent Assembly? What actually the framers of the Constitution in the Constituent Assembly has envisioned the role of the governor? So let's understand this dimension as well. Now we all knew that governor is not directly elected and he is also not indirectly elected. Governor is appointed by the president, and in fact governor is also known as the constitutional head of the state and also executive head of the state, right? So therefore the members of the Constituent Assembly feared that a nominated governor, because here it is a nominated governor or an appointed governor. Now in fact a nominated governor could be a remote controlled governor, and he could also be an agent of the central government, and that has been what is happening now. Very often governor is being controlled by the central government, so therefore it has been reflecting the colonial era governors under the Government of India Act of 1935, right? So the members of the Constituent Assembly feared that governor may be controlled by the center. And as of now also central government has been largely controlling the governors. So therefore it has been reflecting the colonial era governors who are largely controlled by the government of under the Government of India Act 1935. However, what Dr. B.R. Ambedkar has said to alleviate the fears of the members of the Constituent Assembly with respect to the governor who is a nominated governor. Now in fact governor is purely a constitutional governor. He would not be an elected member. He would be purely a constitutional governor, and he also bound by the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers. A post of governor who is a constitutional head and executive head of the state must act as per the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers. This is what Dr. B.R. Ambedkar has emphasized in the Constituent Assembly. And in fact, the office is not meant to rival the elected ministry or function as an arm of the union government. So that is why there is a need for a nominated governor to make sure that the constitutional machinery has been going as smoothly as possible in the state level. So this is what Dr. B.R. Ambedkar has emphasized in the Constituent Assembly with respect to the role of the governor as a constitutional head. So let's understand the discretionary powers of the governor. Now in fact governors also enjoy certain discretionary powers as well. So let's understand what discretionary powers that governors enjoy in this context. Now if we talk about the discretionary powers, governors enjoy two different types of discretionary powers. One is known as constitutional discretion and second is situational discretion. So these are two different types of discretion enjoyed by the governor. Now what are the matters which falls under the constitutional discretion of governor? Now if we talk about that, when the governors have to reserve the bill for the consideration of the president. So understand that Article 200 of the Indian Constitution, it provides a set of options for the governors. Now one such option is governor may reserve the bill for the consideration of the president. So therefore this might be considered as a constitutional discretion of the governor. Second constitutional discretion is when he has to recommend for president's rule in the state. Now in case of the failure of the constitutional machinery under Article 356 of the Indian Constitution and also under Article 365 of the Indian Constitution. So in case of failure of the constitutional machinery in the state, the governor may recommend imposition of president's rule in the state. So this is also a constitutional discretionary power of the governor. And third one is when given additional charge as administrator of union territory also, he may have a constitutional discretion. And then let's understand the situational discretion of the governors. For example, when it comes to appointing a chief minister, after no party has got clear majority or when incumbent dies in the office, it is the responsibility of the governor to call the next candidate or next political party which enjoys majority in the house. So this also forms part of the situational discretion of the governor. Secondly, when he dismisses the council of ministers on an inability to prove confidence in the legislative assembly, this is also a situational discretion. And when he dissolves assembly when it loses its majority, so this also forms part of the situational discretion. So I hope you have understood both the constitutional discretion and situational discretion that governors enjoy. Now let's understand the discretionary powers and the intended limits of the discretionary powers of governor, because understand here that when Article 200 of the Indian Constitution says or it provides certain options to the governors, whenever any bill is passed by the state legislative assembly and the state legislative assembly then send the bill to the governor for his or her assent, governor is not giving assent to those bills. However, the governor here has been giving the reason that it is the discretion of the governor whether to give assent to the bills or not. Right? So therefore, governor has been using this discretionary power not to give assent to the bills passed by the state legislative assembly. Now, at this point of time, let's understand the intended limits of the discretionary powers of the governor. Now, in fact, the discretionary powers of the governors are limited and explicit. Right? So whatever discretionary powers which are actually provided by the Constitution, so only those discretionary powers that the governors will enjoy. And in fact, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar has also clarified that Constitution provides a very limited discretionary powers to the governor. Governors won't enjoy a wide discretionary powers, they enjoy very limited discretionary powers, first thing. And second thing, discretion applies only to specific situations. What are those specific situations? We have already discussed that constitutional discretionary powers and situational discretionary powers, because these are the discretionary powers whether through a convention or through a constitutional provision has provided to the governor of a state. So because of that reason, the governor will have a very limited discretionary power. And that too, the discretionary power extends to these matters alone, which are provided in the Constitution. Now, in fact, no power of discretion is to be inferred unless specifically and expressly mentioned in any of these constitutional provisions. However, let's also understand that not an interfering authority as well. Right? So in fact, the governor was not expected to influence everyday governance, and in fact the legislative processes as well. So governor as an office, as a constitutional head, has been created to act based on the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers. He enjoys a very limited discretionary power, and governor should not interfere in the functioning of the legislature or day-to-day legislative processes. So this is very, very clear from the discussions and debates of the Constituent Assembly. However, so let's understand the reservation of bills by the governor for the consideration of the president or withholding of the bills, which is a modern flashpoint under Article 200 of the Indian Constitution. However, in the Constituent Assembly, when debates have been taking place, some of the members of the Constituent Assembly, such as N.G. Ranga and R.K. Chowdhury, so they actually warned that allowing governors to reserve bills for the consideration of the president would undermine the elected legislature, because it may delay giving assent to those bills which are being passed by the state legislative assemblies. This is what the members of the Constituent Assembly have warned with respect to reservation of the bills passed by the state legislature by the governor. However, Ambedkar has also clarified this again. So what Ambedkar has said, reservation for the president is not a discretionary power of the governor. However, reservation of the bills, it only applies to bills that affect the center-state relations or violation of the constitutional provision. Now imagine if the state legislative assembly passed any bill and this bill is violating the center-state relations and it has been violating the constitutional provisions, only in that case alone the governor may reserve the bills for the consideration of the president. Otherwise, he cannot reserve every bill for the consideration of the president, because it may lead to the delay in giving assent to those bills. Right? So in fact, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar has also clarified that governor is not expected to sit in judgment over the bills. He must give his assent to the bills based on the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers, and that is why the office of the governor as a constitutional office has been created. However, the vision of the constitutional framers, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, contrasts sharply with the recent cases. Now, what has been happening in recent cases? In recent cases, governors are not giving assent to the bills passed by the state legislative assemblies, and that we have been experiencing in states like Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Telangana, Punjab. In all these states, governors are not giving assent to the bills passed by the state legislative assemblies. However, in this context, there is a need for a cooperative federalism. And apart from that, it is also expected that governor must act based on the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers. Governor must play a neutral and impartial role when it comes to giving assent to the bills. Governor must not act as an agent of the central government. So, governor must be bound by the constitutional principles as well. Must uphold the dignity of the office of the governor as a constitutional office. Right? So that's how you can also conclude this. Now let's discuss another very important topic, and this topic is talking about India's disaster preparedness and how the center is not ready to provide assistance to states which are facing several disasters. So let's understand this, and this could be very important, and this could be important for General Studies paper 2 and General Studies paper 3 as well. Right? So let's understand what is the context here. Now the context here is that, so India's intergovernmental disaster financing system. Right? So intergovernmental disaster financing system in the sense that states are vulnerable. States are first responders. And states also need to finance the disaster recovery, disaster preparedness, mitigation, and adaptation. However, in this context, the center must help assist the state governments as well to deal with these disasters in a better manner. Now, also understand that India as a country is also vulnerable to several disasters. And in fact, the frequency and intensity of these disasters has further increased because of the climate change. However, recently we have seen disasters like landslides in Wayanad, cyclones in the eastern coast of India and western coast of India, landslides in the Himalayan region, earthquakes, heat waves, urban floods. So we have been observing all these problems. There is infrastructure loss, loss of lives, and also damages which are being caused across the different states. So therefore, let's understand this in detailed manner, taking into consideration Wayanad landslides. So we all knew that in 2024, a district in Wayanad, a district in Kerala, which is Wayanad, has experienced worst landslides. Right? So therefore, these landslides have been highlighting the concerns over India's fiscal federal structure. Now, what is this fiscal federal structure? So the fiscal federal structure indicates the transfer of finances from the union government to the state governments to deal with these natural disasters. Right? So in fact, the fiscal federal structure has been drifting from cooperative to a conditional centralism, and this is the key concern here. However, you can also go through the reasons or the major causes of landslides in Wayanad in the year 2024 as well. So now let's try and understand. So taking into consideration Wayanad landslides, so how it has led to a fiscal mismatch, fiscal federal structure. In fact, it has got disturbed. It has not followed properly. Now, in fact, in 2024, we all knew that landslides in Wayanad district has caused a disastrous and a worst impact. Now, in fact, the losses estimated is around 1200 crore rupees. However, Kerala sought 2200 crore for the recovery. Right? So the losses are 1200, but to achieve the recovery, so Kerala requires 2200 crores of funds. However, how much the center has provided? Center has just provided 260 crore for the state of Kerala after this Wayanad landslides. So total losses is 1200 and total amount sought by the Kerala is 2200, but amount given by the central government is just 260 crore, which is just 11% of what Kerala has sought. Right? So therefore, it clearly shows a fiscal mismatch. Center is not ready to provide funds to the state governments which are worst affected by these natural disasters. And apart from that, there is an inappropriate delay in classifying the event as a severe disaster. Right? And in fact, restricted access to National Disaster Response Fund as well. So all these factors have been making state governments not able to receive proper funding for combating various disasters and its worst effects. Now, if center is not providing funding to the state governments, how state governments would start adopting the mitigation measures, the recovery measures, how state governments will become resilient to deal with these disasters, and that is the major question here. However, this is not specific to Kerala. There are other examples also where a fiscal mismatch is clearly visible. For example, Cyclone Gaza in Tamil Nadu 2018. Inadequate fund has been given to the state of Tamil Nadu, and Karnataka floods 2019 and Himachal Pradesh Uttarakhand cloudburst in recent years. Now, in all these cases, inadequate amount of fund has been dispersed to the state governments, and these funds are not adequate to deal with the recovery. However, this actually signals from the central government an erosion of cooperative federalism. So cooperative federalism envisioned a federalism which is based on confidence, mutual trust, and cooperating each other. However, if center is not ready to disperse funds to the state governments to deal with these disasters, then it may lead to the erosion of cooperative federalism, placing disproportionate fiscal burden, fiscal stress on the state governments. However, let's understand some structural issues in India's disaster financing system, because there are some structural issues as well. The first structural issue is outdated and rigid relief norms. Right? So if center has been providing relief to the state governments, very often this relief is outdated and rigid. So it is associated with such rigid norms. For example, the compensation ceilings that center is providing to the state governments unchanged for the last 1 decade, right? So in fact, there is inflation, and in fact there is also changing economic dynamics, and despite then the center has not changed the compensation ceilings. For example, 4 lakh is provided by the center for a life lost and 1.2 lakh for a fully damaged house. So there is a need for a revision of this compensation amount immediately, and this amount is insufficient for reconstruction, increasing states' fiscal burden as well. So if center has been giving an inadequate amount of money to the states for the recovery purpose, then the fiscal stress, the fiscal burden is on the state governments, and state governments also have a very limited financial resources with them, and that's the main problem here. And apart from that, there is also an ambiguity which is existing in classifying severe disasters. For example, the Disaster Management Act 2005 does not define what constitutes a severe disaster, right? So therefore, it actually provides the union government a wider discretion to define a disaster as a severe disaster. Now, wider discretion for the central government actually means that center may not provide the relief compensation for all the disasters that the state governments have been facing. But on the other hand, at the ground level, the state governments have been facing the exceptional stress, exceptional burden on their finances, and then the procedural and not automatic fund releases. However, with respect to the release of funds, very often the release of fund is multi-layered approval. So it involves multiple layers of approvals. State memorandum, central team will be sent to the state governments, and a high-level sanction committee. So therefore, all these factors have been leading to delay in providing relief to the state governments, increasing the fiscal stress, fiscal burden on the state governments, forcing state governments to take measures on their own. If state governments don't have adequate amount of financial resources with them, it may lead to poor relief measures, poor recovery, and state governments may not go for the resilient measures that needed to tackle such disasters. So let's understand the way forward in this context. Rebuilding cooperative federalism. So how can we build cooperative federalism, which involves the fiscal federalism, right? So in fact, as of now, the 16th Finance Commission has already been constituted by the President. Now, the 16th Finance Commission must update the relief norms to reflect the current economic conditions. Secondly, develop comprehensive disaster vulnerability index. So why don't we develop a comprehensive disaster vulnerability index and also ensure union assistance? It remains grant based and not loan linked, right? So if it is grant based, then there may not be a need for the state governments to repay it with the interest. However, if it is a loan based, then state governments might have to repay it, and further increasing burden on the state governments. And then there is also a need to develop a comprehensive disaster vulnerability index. And apart from that, why don't we strengthen the state's autonomy to deal with these disasters on their own? Right? For that particular purpose, provide the states operational control over these disaster funds so that the states can better manage these disasters. States can also ensure the vulnerability could be reduced. The best example is how Odisha became a cyclone prone area, cyclone vulnerable area to cyclone resilient area, cyclone resilient state. Now in fact, shift union's role to post audit verification instead of the prior approvals given by the, for example, if central government has been giving funds to the state governments for the recovery of these disasters, now why don't the central government go for the audit verification? rather than just giving the approvals of these funds. And then adopt objective triggers as well. So objective triggers in the sense that, for example, so a certain rainfall intensity, so more than this rainfall intensity, then it might be considered as a severe natural disaster, and it may also be associated with the economic losses to infrastructure, damage to housing, and also the loss of lives. So therefore, there is a need to provide compensation to the states. There is a need to provide fiscal relief to the states, and fatalities per million population and loss to gross state domestic product ratio. So all these factors can be considered as objective triggers for providing immediate relief for the state governments to adopt recovery measures. And apart from that, you can also go through the average annual disaster. Now, in fact, the annual average disaster losses amounts to 50,000 crore rupees in India, right? So I hope you have understood this. And next very important topic, India has recently launched Operation Sagar Bandhu to provide relief supplies to Sri Lanka, because Sri Lanka has been batting with the recent tropical cyclone. So in this context, let's understand from the syllabus point of view, this could be very important for general studies paper 2. Now, in fact, India launches Operation Sagar Bandhu for Sri Lanka, right? So in fact, this Sagar Bandhu, it aimed to deliver emergency humanitarian aid to the cyclone hit Sri Lanka, because Sri Lanka has recently faced a cyclone, and in this Operation Sagar Bandhu, both INS Vikrant and INS Udaygiri are part of providing relief material to Sri Lanka. And in fact, Prime Minister Narendra Modi had assured continuous support to Sri Lanka under India's Neighborhood First policy and even Vision Mahasagar to help the Sri Lanka to recover from cyclone Ditwa, right? So it has been facing the worst impact of cyclone Ditwa, and in order to provide relief and assistance to Sri Lanka, Indian Navy has deployed INS Vikrant, INS Udaygiri under its flagship operation called Operation Sagar Bandhu. So India will provide all necessary assistance to Sri Lanka under India's Neighborhood First policy and Vision Mahasagar as well, right? So in this context, as you have already understood, that Sri Lanka has been facing cyclone Ditwa, and this cyclone Ditwa has led to the loss of hundreds of lives as well. So therefore, in this context, it is important to provide essential relief supplies to the Sri Lanka. And Indian Navy has launched Operation Sagar Bandhu, right? And in fact, both INS Vikrant and INS Udaygiri have involved as part of Operation Sagar Bandhu. Now, in fact, this operation reflects India's humanitarian outreach to its neighbors in moments of crisis under India's Neighborhood First policy and also under Vision Mahasagar. So let's understand some key terms with respect to India's Sagar, which is known as security and growth for all in the region, and Mahasagar vision. Now, if we talk about the Sagar, it's a doctrine that has been launched in the year 2015 by the government of India. Now, in fact, this is a maritime vision for India, and Sagar stands for security and growth for all in the region. Now, in fact, Sagar focuses on certain elements or components including maritime security, capacity building, focusing on cooperation among all the littoral countries to further strengthen India's net security provider status in the Indian Ocean region and beyond. And Vision Mahasagar 2024 and 25. In fact, this Vision Mahasagar has been announced by Prime Minister Narendra Modi to enhance India's comprehensive engagement with Global South. Now, in fact, India is also known as the leader or the emerging leader of the Global South. So therefore, there is a need for proactive engagement with all the countries in the Global South. For that particular purpose, Prime Minister Narendra Modi announced Mahasagar Vision. So this Mahasagar vision focuses on humanitarian aid to countries which have been in conflict, which have been facing natural disasters, improving connectivity and crisis response partnerships with all other like-minded countries to assist the conflict stricken, disaster stricken global south countries. And apart from that, in India, we have also launched Neighborhood First policy to further strengthen India's relations with all our neighbors. And in fact, under India's Neighborhood First policy, India has been providing all necessary support to all of our neighboring countries, whether it is developmental support, infrastructure support, disaster aid, or even the defense cooperation also. There has been a proactive engagement from the Indian side to all these countries. And humanitarian assistance and disaster relief role of Indian Navy. Now, in fact, Indian Navy has been playing a very important or a very pivotal role. Now, in fact, India has actively conducted humanitarian assistance and disaster relief missions like Operation Neer, Operation Dost, and Sagar missions. Operation Dost has been already conducted with respect to Turkey, and Operation Neer providing drinking water to Maldives. So therefore, all these operations are already successfully conducted by Indian Navy. So that's all for today, and thank you so much. So please subscribe our YouTube channel and also like our video. Thank you so much.